Welcome to Meteorology Matters. When we think of a hurricane, our minds often rush to the immediate devastation, the terrifying force of the wind, the relentless surge of water, the chaos that overtakes everything in its path.
Absolutely. That initial impact is just devastating.
But what truly happens after the storm clears? What kind of aftermath unfolds once the initial blast has passed?
That's the critical question, isn't it?
In the case of New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina, this period became, as one former mayor described it, a profound laboratory for innovation and change.
Laboratory. That's a loaded term.
It is. And it immediately begs a critical question.
Yeah.
For whom was this innovation truly happening? And, what kind of change actually materialized on the ground, especially for the city's most vulnerable residents?
Precisely. Because natural disasters like powerful hurricanes, they don't just strike a blank slate, they hit existing social structures.
Right.
And in doing so, they often reveal and frankly brutally amplify the pre-existing inequalities already embedded within those structures.
So it rips the cover off things that were already there.
Exactly. Which compels us to ask, what does recovery genuinely mean when its experience is so dramatically uneven across a city's population?
That's our focus for this Meteorology Matters exploration. We want to look beyond the immediate headlines, uncover the underlying processes that led to this, well, deeply unequal recovery.
And we need to focus particularly on the specific challenges encountered by different communities. A critical eye needs to be on the experiences of low-income African-American women and their families.
Because their story is so central to understanding this.
It really is. We'll explore how policies and practices, even those often presented as well-intentioned, maybe even neutral, can inadvertently, or sometimes quite deliberately, deepen existing societal divides.
And fundamentally reshape a city along its most entrenched fault lines of race and gender.
Yeah, those fault lines become starkly visible.
That's a powerful framing. So let's really zoom in on this idea of New Orleans as a laboratory and understand what kind of experiment was actually conducted. Mayor Mitch Landry, as you mentioned, once lauded the city as the nation's most immediate lab for innovation and change.
It's quite a boast, isn't it?
It is. But this grand experiment, as it was sometimes termed, came with a very real and unevenly distributed cost. Academic and journalistic analyses of the period really highlight how a major crisis can become a powerful lever for what some critics have termed disaster capitalism.
Right, this idea that a crisis becomes an opportunity.
Exactly, an opportunity for certain interests. Some observers noted that the decade after Katrina presented a model case study of this, a period where significant parts of the state's responsibilities and assets were essentially sold off or transferred to private players.
While citizens were still reeling.
While they were still reeling from the immediate disaster. And what's more, these reforms were then quickly made permanent, cementing a new landscape. It's a stark thought that a catastrophe could be viewed and leveraged in that way.
It's a key takeaway here, how the concept of disaster capitalism provides a crucial lens. It helps us understand the rapid acceleration of what we often call neoliberal policies.
Can you unpack that term neoliberal in this context?
Sure. So neoliberalism here refers to a set of market-oriented solutions that tend to prioritize private interests over public services. It often advocates for reduced state intervention, favoring private sector involvement instead.
Okay.
And when a city is devastated, a common argument emerges that traditional governmental approaches have failed.
Which sort of clears the path.
It clears the way for these new market-driven solutions. In New Orleans, this meant an accelerated intensification of development and policy changes that, frankly, policymakers and business elites in other places could only dream of implementing so swiftly.
Like what kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, we saw dramatic examples. Within just 3 months of Katrina, the Louisiana legislature controversially fired 7,500 teachers.
7,500, wow.
Yeah, and took over 107 New Orleans schools. Most of those were then closed or privatized, transformed into charter schools. That's a massive shift in public education, done incredibly quickly.
Unbelievably fast.
Similarly, the city's major public housing projects, which were absolutely vital for many low-income families, predominantly African-American families, they were systematically leveled.
Torn down.
Torn down and handed over to private developers. The plan was to replace them with mixed-income communities.
Which sounds okay on the surface, maybe. Mixed income.
Well, the reality was they ultimately housed significantly fewer families. We're talking a staggering 64% reduction in available, deeply affordable units compared to what was there before.
64% reduction. That's huge.
It's huge. So these swift, profound changes, often cloaked in the language of efficiency, innovation, progress, they reveal how a crisis can become this powerful lever for a neoliberal agenda.
Prioritizing private interests, profit.
Over genuine public benefit, often at the direct expense of the city's most vulnerable citizens, especially those women-heading households we mentioned earlier.
It sounds like this played out as a stark tale of two cities then.
Yeah.
Can you unpack how this rapid reinvention created such vastly different realities for residents?
It absolutely did. On one hand, you had this narrative of rapid rebuilding. 80% of homes destroyed, yet a staggering $71 billion in federal support poured in. That signals a monumental effort, right?
Yeah, huge sums of money.
But the human story behind that reinvention, it painted a dramatically different picture for distinct communities. We witnessed profound demographic shifts.
Like the numbers you mentioned earlier.
Exactly, a tragic figure. 90,000 African-American residents who, years later, still had not returned to their homes.
90,000 people. Just gone from the city fabric.
And alongside that, an influx of approximately 30,000 new residents, most of whom were white. This wasn't just a statistical shift. It was a fundamental reshaping of the city's cultural and social fabric.
And the language used reflected this divide, didn't it?
Completely. The very language used exposed these deep fault lines. What was uniformly described as an existential crisis for many longtime residents, especially those displaced,
Became an opportunity.
became framed as an opportunity for a select few with capital and political connections, and what was officially labeled neighborhood revitalization from above.
Was experienced as something else entirely on the ground.
Undeniable gentrification by those who were being pushed out, their communities transformed beyond recognition, often losing the very character that made them home.
Delving deeper into that, one notable aspect is how this tale of two cities narrative, while often presented as somehow unique to New Orleans.
Right, like it was some kind of isolated case.
Yeah, it actually masks a much more universal pattern of urban redevelopment, doesn't it?
It really does. The notion that New Orleans was an isolated site of exception, a one-off, incomparable case, it serves to obscure a critical truth. Its post-Katrina development actually provided a powerful prototype, a blueprint almost, for urban policies that are either already underway or being considered in other cities facing similar challenges. Think New York, Cleveland, Detroit.
So what happened there wasn't just about New Orleans.
Not at all. The provisional extensions of power that were initially justified during what was deemed a state of exception right after the storm, they quickly became normalized within routine governance.
Standard operating procedure, basically.
Essentially, yes. The redevelopment strategies employed in this site of exception served as a blueprint for how to leverage a crisis for that neoliberal agenda we talked about.
Where private interests and profit maximization get prioritized.
Over genuine public benefit and the needs of existing communities. So this isn't merely about New Orleans. It's a profound lesson in how cities across the globe can and do respond to crises.
And the often unequal choices they make about who ultimately benefits from the so-called recovery.
Exactly. Who gets included and who gets left behind.
So, if New Orleans became this reluctant laboratory for urban change, it's crucial to understand the foundation upon which this experiment was built. What kind of city was it before Katrina hit? Was it a blank slate? Or were there pre-existing conditions that made it especially vulnerable?
Oh, absolutely not a blank slate. Far from it.
What did the housing landscape look like in New Orleans before the hurricane?
It's vital to recognize that New Orleans was already grappling with deep-seated inequalities, particularly concerning housing affordability, long before Katrina made landfall.
Okay.
The hurricane didn't create these problems. It simply, as you said earlier, blew the roof off them, quite literally, and magnified their devastating impact.
So what did that look like on the ground pre-Katrina?
Even back in 2000, 5 years before the hurricane, census data revealed that 2/3, 2 out of 3 of extremely low-income households in New Orleans were already considered cost-burdened.
Cost-burden meaning?
Meaning they were spending over 30% of their income, and often much, much more, just to keep a roof over their heads.
Leaving precious little for food, healthcare, anything else.
Precisely. And furthermore, homeownership rates in New Orleans were significantly lower than both state and national averages. Less than half of households own their homes.
Less than half. So a majority were renters.
Yes, a very large portion of the city's population was already in a precarious housing situation, renting, often struggling to make ends meet. This made them extremely vulnerable when any significant disruption occurred, let alone something on the scale of Katrina.
That paints a stark picture of pre-existing vulnerability. So, with a city already struggling with housing, how did Katrina itself impact these fragile communities? Did the storm affect everyone equally, or did it, as you suggested, exploit and amplify those pre-existing economic and racial disparities?
Oh, the impact was anything but indiscriminate. When Katrina struck, it didn't just cause widespread destruction, it hit the poorest neighborhoods hardest.
What was that? Location.
Often, yes. It specifically wiped out most high-poverty census tracts. These were frequently historically African-American communities located in lower-lying areas, making them geographically more susceptible to flooding.
So the geography itself was tied to historical segregation patterns.
Absolutely. The sheer scale of destruction was immense. An estimated 80% of the city was flooded. A staggering 134,000 occupied housing units were damaged.
134,000. That's roughly 70% of all occupied residential units in the city.
70%. It's almost unimaginable. This disproportionate impact unequivocally highlights how environmental disasters are never solely natural phenomena.
They become social disasters.
Profoundly social disasters that exploit and exacerbate pre-existing economic and racial disparities. That foundational instability in housing affordability meant that when the storm surge came, the communities already living on the margins were the ones most utterly devastated.
Facing not just physical destruction,
but the complete unraveling of their social and economic fabric, losing homes, jobs, schools, community networks, everything.
And here's where the story becomes even more critical and, frankly, heartbreaking. At the very core of this pre-existing crisis, and its severe exacerbation post-Katrina, was a profound, gendered, and racialized impact.
Yes, this is absolutely central.
The data reveals a stark and undeniable reality. Public housing tenants who faced the most severe displacement and uncertainty were predominantly low-income African-American women and their families. Can you elaborate on the specific numbers?
The statistics are indeed compelling and paint a clear picture of who bore the heaviest burden. As of 2008, a few years after the storm, a striking 77% of households in public housing.
Over three-quarters.
Yes, and an even higher 88% of voucher-subsidized housing units in the New Orleans metropolitan area were headed by women.
88% with vouchers.
Wow! This means that low-income African-American women were overwhelmingly at the epicenter of this housing crisis, both before and especially after Katrina.
And as heads of households, the burden on them must have been immense.
Immense. These women bore the multifaceted brunt of the disaster. They were often solely responsible for finding new, stable housing for their families in a completely decimated market.
Impossible conditions.
Trying to place their children in new schools, often in unfamiliar cities or states, navigating the complex and utterly disrupted landscape of social services, employment, daily life.
All amidst rapidly rising costs and extremely limited options.
Exactly. Their struggle wasn't just for shelter. It was for the very stability and future of their families. Their experiences are absolutely central to understanding the true human cost of recovery.
And how pre-existing racial and gender divides were not only revealed but tragically deepened after the storm.
Deepened and in many ways institutionalized by the recovery process itself.
It's truly difficult to grasp the scale of this. The very places meant to house the city's most vulnerable were torn down, and what replaced them housed significantly fewer people, and often not the original residents.
That's the crux of it.
Let's talk about New Orleans' traditional public housing, known locally as the Big Four, multi-storied complexes like B.W. Cooper, St. Bernard, C.J. Peet, and Lafitte. These weren't flimsy structures, were they?
Not at all. They were solidly built brick structures.
And even after the storm and flood, they were pronounced structurally sound.
That's correct. Engineering reports deemed them sound.
Yet the Housing Authority of New Orleans, ANO, pursued aggressive demolition plans, even taking legal action to enable it. Can you detail the scale of this demolition?
The scale was immense. Approximately 4,500 public housing units, despite being deemed structurally sound, were slated for demolition.
4,500 units. Gone.
And the plans proposed to replace them with only 1,600 units of mixed-income housing.
From 4,500 down to 1,600, that's a massive reduction already.
And crucially, of these new 1,600 units, only about one-third would be deeply subsidized, meaning genuinely affordable to the lowest-income residents, the original tenants.
So only around 500 truly affordable units replacing 4,500.
That's the math. By 2013, the redevelopment had ultimately replaced 6,171 pre-storm public housing units citywide, including others beyond the Big Four, with a mere 2,114 new units.
Okay, so a slightly broader picture there.
Yeah.
6,171 down to 2,114. Still a huge loss.
A huge loss. And of these new 2,114 units, only half were subsidized or public housing. The other half were market rate.
Meaning completely unaffordable for the original residents.
For the vast majority, yes. This represents a drastic reduction in deeply affordable housing stock, a loss of over 65% of those original units. It fundamentally transformed the housing support landscape for thousands of families.
Particularly those headed by low-income African-American women who had relied on these homes.
They were disproportionately impacted by this demolition and the failure to replace those units adequately.
That's a staggering reduction. And this large-scale demolition was funded through a specific federal initiative, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Could you tell us more about the Hope 6 program and how Katrina impacted its implementation in New Orleans?
Absolutely. This large-scale demolition was primarily funded through the Federal Homeownership and Opportunity for People Everywhere program, known as Hope 6.
Hope 6, okay.
This program, initiated back in the early 1990s, was originally designed to revitalize severely distressed public housing. The idea was to demolish existing high-rise structures and replace them with smaller, mixed-income communities.
But often with significantly fewer deeply affordable units, as we just heard.
That was often the outcome, yes. And what's particularly striking in New Orleans is that before Katrina, only one Hope 6 project was even planned for the city.
Just one.
Just one. And there were reports the Bush administration was actually considering canceling the program entirely nationwide due to mixed results and growing concerns about displacement.
So it wasn't exactly a universally loved program at the time.
No. But the hurricane created an opportunity, quote unquote, to accelerate its implementation in New Orleans with what observers described as zeal.
Using the crisis to push through a program that might have otherwise faded away.
Precisely. And the underlying ideological shift here, often called the deconcentration thesis, argued that mixing income levels would somehow benefit the poor.
How so? What was the argument?
The argument was it would expose them to middle-class role models and opportunities, thereby breaking cycles of poverty, sort of social engineering through architecture.
And the outcome?
Well, as we just discussed, the practical outcome was a massive reduction in deeply subsidized units. It effectively pushed out the poorest residents who, as we've established, were overwhelmingly low-income African-American women and their children.
So the colorblind rhetoric of social integration.
In practice, had a profoundly racialized and gendered impact. It arguably exacerbated the very inequalities it claimed to address by dismantling vital community infrastructure without adequately replacing it for those who needed it most.
And the effects of this demolition and displacement didn't stop at the public housing complexes themselves, did they? They rippled across the entire city's housing market.
Oh, absolutely, created immense pressure.
How did this impact rents? And what were the consequences for the city's low-waged renters? The majority of the population.
The consequences were immediate and severe. Rents across New Orleans rose sharply and dramatically. The median rent was up an astonishing 89% since 2000.
89%.
And we saw a particularly brutal 39% increase in just the 3 years between 2005 and 2008 alone, right after the storm.
Just when people could least afford it.
Exactly. This rapid escalation created what many called a second exodus. It hit low-waged renters who were disproportionately African-American especially hard.
A second wave of displacement driven by economics this time.
You got it. Imagine 36% of renters in Orleans Parish, a significant jump from 24% pre-storm, were forced to pay 50% or more of their pre-tax income just for housing.
Half their income just for rent.
Leaving them with extremely limited resources for everything else: food, transportation, childcare. It's an impossible situation.
And for those displaced public housing residents, could they even access the new mixed-income housing?
It was incredibly difficult. They faced much tighter eligibility restrictions and significantly higher affordability thresholds.
So even the affordable units weren't affordable for them.
Often not. These new units were typically only affordable to those making maybe 40% to 100% of the area median income, not the original 30% or less that the most vulnerable residents relied on.
So it was a complete overhaul that essentially screamed out the poorest.
It effectively made it nearly impossible for many to return to their communities or even remain in the city. It locked them out of the new New Orleans being built.
That demonstrates such a systemic issue, where the very policies designed, ostensibly to facilitate recovery, instead created new barriers and reinforced existing ones.
Exactly. It really leaves us wondering who was truly benefiting from this redevelopment.
The narrative of rebuilding often focuses on, shiny new buildings, economic revitalization.
But the human cost of these shifts is immense. The policies implemented created a system where the very people who had lived in and contributed to these communities for generations found themselves locked out.
The drastic reduction in affordable housing, soaring rents, stricter rules.
It meant that the New Orleans was not, in fact, built for the old New Orleanians, particularly the most vulnerable ones.
And this systematic process of displacement disproportionately affecting low-income African-American women and their families.
It reveals how a market-driven recovery can deepen rather than alleviate socioeconomic divides. It clearly demonstrates a racial and gendered bias in the ultimate outcomes of these post-disaster policies,
turning recovery itself into a mechanism for demographic and economic restructuring that favored a different population.
That's a harsh but accurate assessment of the outcome for many.
Speaking of market-driven recovery, let's turn our attention to the architects of much of this change. The developers themselves and what some have dubbed the gentrification is good theology.
Right, the idea that market forces will lift all boats, even if some get swamped in the process.
You had powerful local figures like Press Kabikoff and Sean Cummings, both from families with deep roots in real estate, who really championed this approach. Kabikoff's company, HRI Properties, for instance, specialized in inner-city revitalization.
Often through privatizing public housing and creating these mixed-income communities we've been discussing.
Exactly. And projects like the New Orleans Healing Center or the Bywater Art Lofts, often funded by a mix of tax credits and grants,
were explicitly designed to attract the creative class, ostensibly to drive economic growth for the city.
It really felt like these, urban alchemists were turning crisis into what they called growth. But as we're hearing, this growth wasn't for everyone.
Not at all. And it's striking to observe how these developers weren't merely reacting to market forces, they were actively shaping them.
How so?
They actively leveraged their influence to modify federal policy in ways that profoundly benefited their projects and their particular vision for the city.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Take Press Kabikoff again. He successfully lobbied to double the income threshold for affordable housing units.
Doubling the threshold. What does that mean practically?
It meant properties could qualify for affordable status and the associated subsidies, even if they were priced well out of reach for the city's poorest residents. It broadened the definition to include more moderate incomes,
making it easier for developers to fill units, but not necessarily helping those most in need.
Precisely. He also successfully advocated for artists to be eligible for affordable housing, which, while seeming positive, also served that broader goal of attracting a specific creative class demographic seen as key to gentrification.
And Sean Cummings.
His Reinventing the Crescent project involved a massive $300 million transformation of the Mississippi riverfront, and he acquired much of the city-owned land for it while he was concurrently chairing the New Orleans Building Corporation.
Wait, he was chairing the city agency selling the land that he was buying.
That's what the record suggests. It certainly raised significant ethical questions about the blurring lines between private gain and public service,
underscoring how private interests weren't just participating in the recovery. They were actively shaping the rules of the game.
To their substantial benefit, yes. This symbiotic relationship between powerful developers and governmental bodies further solidified a market-first agenda, often at the expense of long-established, vulnerable communities.
And what's truly striking, almost jarring, is that some of these developers were quite candid about the consequences of their actions.
They were surprisingly open at times.
Press Kabikoff himself, when discussing the effects of revitalization efforts, was quoted saying, and I'm quoting directly here, "In terms of race, black people in this town have less money. When neighborhoods revitalize, I think it chases all poor out. And in our city, the poor are almost all black, so it's more of a coincidence."
Coincidence?
He continues, "And there's probably some racism involved in that. That's the downside of neighborhood improvement."
Wow, that's quite an admission. The downside of neighborhood improvement is chasing out poor black residents.
It's an unflinching truth, right? A direct acknowledgement of the inherent mechanisms of displacement embedded within this model of market-driven redevelopment.
That statement is incredibly revealing. It forces us to ask, when neighborhood improvement is openly acknowledged to inherently chase out the poor, who are disproportionately black in New Orleans, is that really a coincidence?
Or is it an inherent feature?
Exactly. Is it an inherent and predictable feature of the underlying development model being pushed? Such candid admissions challenge the often assumed neutrality of the market.
Right, the market isn't just some natural force.
No, it reveals the deeply political nature of these economic processes. It exposes how policies, even when framed in colorblind terms about economic efficiency or revitalization, can have profoundly racial and class-based outcomes.
Especially when they prioritize profit and private investment over the fundamental needs and rights of existing communities.
And this is where the racial and gender divides become even more insidious, often coded in that seemingly race-neutral language about income and work ethic, while systematically impacting specific demographics, particularly Black women and their families.
So on one hand, the city wants the jazz, the gumbo, the unique vibe, the vibrant
The
culture.
very things that make New Orleans, New Orleans.
But on the other, it seems to be actively pushing out the
Yeah.
very people who create it. It's such a stark contradiction.
It really is.
New Orleans' unique culture, its live music, distinctive cuisine, iconic architecture, it's absolutely critical to its tourism economy, a major industry. Lieutenant Governor Mich Landrieu even lobbied Congress for millions to support cultural tourism.
Arguing quite rightly that Louisiana has an economic asset that other states can only dream of, a multifaceted, deeply rooted, authentic, and unique culture.
But the very culture bearers, predominantly working-class Black residents, like musicians, chefs, artisans, they face a minefield of obstacles just trying to return home and reestablish their lives.
It's a profound and heartbreaking irony. The city celebrates and aggressively markets its culture.
Yet systematically undermines the ability of the people who embody and create that culture to actually remain within it.
Exactly. The economic realities for these culture bearers, predominantly low-income African-American individuals and families, meant that as the city rebuilt and costs soared, they were being priced out of their own neighborhoods.
Facing immense financial pressure.
Immense. Musicians' average earnings, for instance, remained stagnant at a meager $17,800 per year, according to studies from the time.
$17,000 a year, while the cost of living was skyrocketing.
Skyrocketing. And beyond just economics, they also faced an increasingly hostile environment.
Hostile how?
Stricter noise ordinances, zoning regulations for performance venues, things like that.
Which might be framed as quality of life improvements for new, wealthier residents.
But directly impacted the livelihoods and cultural practices of musicians and artists who rely on those very spaces, bars, clubs, even street corners, to earn a living and share their art.
It sounds like a form of cultural extraction.
That's a good term for it. The aesthetic and economic value of a community's heritage is embraced and commercialized, but the people who create and sustain it are effectively pushed to the margins.
Unable to participate in the revitalization, they are ironically essential to.
And the very presence of working-class Black residents in these newly gentrified neighborhoods was, in essence, sometimes seen as a threat to the perceived improvement and the desired demographic shift of the city.
Let's shift now to what was perhaps the most significant state-sanctioned divide in the post-Katrina recovery, the massive homeownership bias.
Yes, this is absolutely critical to understanding the unequal recovery.
President George W. Bush's vision, declared in Jackson Square just weeks after the storm, was crystal clear. Homeownership is one of the great strengths of any community, and it must be a central part of our vision for the revival of this region.
A strong emphasis on owning property.
Very strong. He even proposed an urban homesteading act for renters, supposedly designed to help them become homeowners. But that initiative never materialized. It just vanished.
Interesting. So the talk was there, but the action wasn't.
Seems that way. Instead, the largest federal program, the Road Home Program, which allotted $15 billion between 2005 and 2007,
A huge amount of money.
went overwhelmingly to homeowners. Can you detail how this program created such a dramatic imbalance?
This brings us to a critical point regarding the state's role in actively perpetuating inequality through policy design, not just passively allowing it.
Okay.
The Road Home Program, despite its massive funding, directed a crucial 80% of its funds to homeowners. 80%.
80% to homeowners. Despite renters being the majority of New Orleans' pre-storm population,
Right.
There was 55%, right?
Exactly. Renters were the majority, 55%. Yet homeowners got 80% of the largest pot of aid. This wasn't just an oversight. It was a direct policy choice that amplified pre-existing disparities based on wealth and race.
And homeowners got other benefits too.
Yes. To make matters worse, homeowners also benefited from the extension of federal tax credits, providing further financial advantages.
And who benefited most from this homeowner focus?
Unsurprisingly, the vast majority of these benefits disproportionately accrued to white homeowners who, due to historical inequities like redlining and discriminatory lending, were much more likely to own property in the first place.
So the program reinforced historical advantages.
Absolutely. This program, while presented as a neutral disaster relief effort, was in fact an extension of historical entitlements that inherently favored property owners. It transformed disaster aid into a mechanism for wealth transfer, bolstering those who already possessed assets rather than being a truly equitable recovery effort.
And it solidified this idea you mentioned, a property-based definition of urban citizenship.
Precisely, where simply owning property dictated who received significant government support and who was largely left to navigate a decimated housing market alone, particularly renters, overwhelmingly African American renters.
So while homeowners were receiving the lion's share of aid, what about renters and the small rental owners who provided most of the city's rental stock? They faced huge disadvantages, right?
Immense disadvantages and frustrating administrative hurdles. The contrast is stark and really highlights a systemic issue.
How little aid went to them.
Only a meager 20% of the road home funds went to small rental owners. Just 20%.
Even though they provided over 80% of the city's pre-storm rental stock.
That's right. These were often local individuals or families who owned maybe a duplex or a few small properties, providing naturally occurring affordable housing to their communities. They were a vital part of the housing ecosystem.
And the hurdles they faced getting that 20%.
Imagine this. Small rental owners only received eligibility letters for road home funds after they had already rebuilt their properties.
Wait, after? How could they rebuild without the funds?
Exactly. It effectively disqualified countless individuals who simply couldn't afford to front the massive costs of reconstruction themselves. It was an impossible catch-22 for many, a bureaucratic nightmare.
That seems designed to fail, almost.
It certainly had that effect. And on top of that, new requirements for improved amenities and adherence to stricter, new building codes, while maybe well-intentioned for future housing quality, added significant, often prohibitive costs and delays for rebuilding affordable rental housing.
Making it even harder and more expensive for those small landlords.
Much harder. And the result? 3 years after the storm, studies showed only 13 rebuilt affordable rental units could be directly attributed to road home funds.
13 out of a $15 billion program.
13 units specifically for affordable rentals from that main program. It's shockingly low compared to the billions poured into homeownership.
Meanwhile, what was happening to property values in areas that didn't flood?
Property values in unflooded, often wealthier and wider areas, like the historically elevated sliver by the river near the Garden District in Uptown, they received a huge boost.
So existing homeowners there saw big profits.
Significant profits, further widening the already massive economic chasm between property owners and renters, and between white and black communities in the city.
That's such a clear example of how housing tenure, whether you owned or rented, became a gatekeeper for full urban participation. It really does seem like there was a tacit, property-based definition of urban citizenship at play.
Indeed, it demonstrates a system where your ability to return to the city, to find work, to enroll your kids in school, to even participate politically was directly tied to whether you owned property.
How did that play out practically with things like temporary housing?
Well, homeowners, for instance, were allowed to place Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, trailers directly on their private property.
Giving them a place to live, even if basic, right in their neighborhood.
Exactly. It gave them a crucial advantage: immediate, albeit temporary, housing. It allowed them to return to work sooner, to oversee repairs, and importantly, to participate in local reconstruction decisions and planning meetings.
And renters.
Renters were not afforded this same right. They couldn't just put a FEMA trailer anywhere. Many were relegated to vast, often isolated trailer camps located outside the city limits.
Cut off from jobs, transportation, their old communities.
Completely cut off, often in areas lacking basic services or social networks. Others faced precarious and often temporary hotel stays or struggled to find scarce, expensive rental accommodations.
So this created that de facto citizenship definition you mentioned.
Yes, a tacit property-based definition of urban citizenship, where without private property, the majority of citizens, particularly low-income African-American women and their families, had no legal or practical claim to return easily to their neighborhoods or to meaningfully participate in the city's political institutions and decision-making processes.
Their physical displacement became a political disenfranchisement as well.
It absolutely did. Losing your home meant losing your foothold in the city in multiple ways.
This whole discussion brings us to some fundamental critiques that seem to resonate across history. We can look back to Friedrich Engels' seminal work from the 19th century, The Housing Question, and see some startling parallels in post-Katrina New Orleans.
It's surprising how relevant those 19th century critiques still feel, isn't it?
It really is. Engels argued that framing housing solutions purely on rights and justice can be insufficient if it doesn't fundamentally address the underlying economic relations and power structures.
Right, the focus on abstract rights can sometimes obscure the concrete economic realities.
So in New Orleans, how did the legal framework of property rights, maybe designed decades ago for different circumstances, become such an unquestionable force, pushing out the very idea of a universal right to housing after a disaster?
That's a crucial connection. Engels' critique helps us understand that legal frameworks, even when presented as neutral or universal, are often deeply rooted in existing economic relations and can serve to mask and perpetuate inequalities.
How did that play out with federal aid?
In post-Katrina New Orleans, federal aid for private property losses became almost automatically legitimized through historical precedent. It became a kind of policy doxa, an unquestioned belief or common opinion within policy circles that property rights were paramount.
So it didn't even need debating anymore.
It felt like it no longer required serious legislative deliberation. This uncritical acceptance of property rights as the primary frame meant that aid flowed predominantly to homeowners without a deeper critical examination of who those homeowners were, who they weren't, and what that meant for broader social equity.
And this sidelined other ways of thinking about recovery.
Absolutely. It supplanted a much-needed broader discussion of inequality and the potential for, say, a right to return or a right to housing for everyone affected. It effectively marginalized the political responses of community groups advocating for renters.
Like ACORN, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform now. They were big in New Orleans, right?
They had their largest chapter in the city, yes. Their efforts to advocate for a more equitable recovery for renters were often dismissed or sidelined because the dominant legalistic approach effectively depoliticized the discussion.
Making it seem like the government was just upholding established rights.
Rather than making a strategic choice that dramatically favored one segment of the population, largely more affluent white residents, over another predominantly low-income African-American women and their families.
Beyond the legal framework, there was also a significant moral component to how the housing crisis was framed, wasn't there? Again, echoing Engels' critique of those who linked housing shortages to the supposed moral failings of the poor.
Yes, that narrative was unfortunately quite prevalent.
In post-Katrina New Orleans, there was a discourse that associated poor people and public housing residents with things like laziness, welfare drainage, a lack of investment in their own neighborhoods.
This is where the racial and gender divides become even more insidious, often coded in that seemingly race-neutral language about income and work ethic, but clearly targeting specific groups.
Can you give some examples of this moralizing rhetoric?
Well, this deserving versus undeserving poor narrative effectively demonized those who were most vulnerable and, conveniently, justified their exclusion from recovery efforts. For instance, the New York Times columnist David Brooks infamously advised integrating people who lack middle-class skills into neighborhoods with people who possess these skills,
Which subtly blames the poor for their own situation, implying they just need exposure to better people.
Exactly. It locates the problem within the individual, not the system. Even more explicitly, the New Orleans City Council president at the time made a highly problematic comment suggesting public housing should be reserved for those willing to work and not for soap opera watchers.
Wow. Directly linking housing insecurity to perceived moral failings or lack of effort. Just blatant.
Blatant. This moralized discourse served to deflect attention from the systemic causes of poverty and housing insecurity, things like low wages, lack of affordable childcare, historical discrimination, and place the blame instead on individuals.
It's a powerful tool for maintaining existing hierarchies, isn't it?
Incredibly powerful. It allows policymakers and perhaps segments of the public to rationalize decisions that deepen inequality by framing them as the natural consequences of individual choices rather than the result of deliberate policy.
And what about the grassroots recovery efforts led by nonprofits and philanthropists? Didn't that help?
While there was a visible push for that, and many groups did amazing work on the ground, the overall structure often masked systematic inequalities in resource distribution. Wealthier, predominantly white homeowner groups were often better connected, had more resources, and were simply more effective at capturing and benefiting from the available aid and philanthropic
So
dollars.
even the grassroots efforts could reflect the existing power dynamics.
To a large extent, yes. The moral framing effectively served as a smokescreen for the continued advance of urban neoliberalism, blaming the poor for their own displacement while facilitating market-driven redevelopment.
And finally, we have to look at the housing question through the lens of urban development itself. How post-Katrina redevelopment was often framed as just urban development as usual.
Right, as if a catastrophic disaster didn't fundamentally change the context.
Ingalls critiqued how modernized housing projects in his time often benefited capitalists more than the poor they were supposedly built for. Here we saw what's been called an unprecedented supply-side policy.
Creating essentially a free enterprise zone with extensive tax-exempt financing, depreciation benefits, things designed to spur private investment.
And what was the outcome of this approach? What got built?
The outcome was a dramatic surge in luxury condos and high-end apartments, catering primarily to wealthier new residents or investors, while deeply affordable housing remained incredibly scarce.
So the subsidies ended up fueling luxury development.
To a significant degree, yes. The expensive tax cuts and incentives associated with this free enterprise zone effectively masked the state's significant hand in subsidizing private, often luxury development, not affordable housing for those displaced.
It's truly paradoxical, then, that in 2009, when the city was still desperate for affordable housing,
The Louisiana State Bond Commission actually stalled affordable housing subsidies for over a year,
stalled them. Why?
citing fears of too much affordable housing. Their stated concern was that an abundance of affordable units would detract from the demand for market-rate housing and thus hinder private development profits.
Let me get this straight. They were worried that helping the poor too much would hurt the market for the rich. In the middle of a housing crisis, after a disaster.
That was the explicit logic presented. It reveals the deeply ingrained market-first agenda.
Any other examples of that thinking?
The Speaker of the Louisiana House of Representatives at the time even expressed concerns about the concentration of low and moderate income people all over the city and its potential major impact on employment and lifestyle.
Wow. That powerfully reveals the underlying social anxieties and biases against lower-income residents, framing their very presence as a problem for the city's desired image and economy.
It demonstrates how the state, under the guise of market-led recovery, actively intervened to protect and expand the interests of the propertied class. The decisions made by institutions like the Bond Commission, cloaked in economic rationale, had direct detrimental consequences for low-income residents.
Particularly low-income African-American women who relied disproportionately on affordable housing.
Exactly. It reveals how the language of urban development can be manipulated to serve specific economic interests, transforming the city itself into a commodity where the perceived value of property and attracting higher-income residents take precedence over the fundamental human right to adequate housing for all.
In the face of all these systemic challenges, though, it's incredibly important to remember that there was and continues to be significant resistance. People didn't just accept this.
No, absolutely not. There was incredible organizing and pushback.
Social justice activists in post-Katrina New Orleans adopted the powerful framework of the right of return for displaced residents.
And, importantly, extended it to argue for a fundamental human right to housing.
Where did that framing come from?
It was firmly grounded in international human rights treaties, specifically citing things like the guiding principles on internal displacement. It tried to elevate the issue beyond local politics to universal principles.
And they took legal action, too.
Yes, they filed a major class action lawsuit against the Department of Housing and Urban Development HUD, known as the NOAA case, representing public housing residents who had lost their homes and were being denied return.
So, a powerful attempt to challenge the established narrative and the legal frameworks that were facilitating displacement using a human rights lens.
A very powerful attempt. But it illustrates the formidable obstacles faced when trying to challenge entrenched power structures and dominant ideologies.
Especially when those structures are clearly benefiting from the very crisis they are supposedly addressing.
Right. Human rights organizations, or HROs, faced significant difficulties in actually advancing these human rights frames within the established housing and community development field, the HCD field.
Why with that? Weren't people receptive?
It was complicated. Many chose an inside strategy, trying to work within existing institutional channels to effect change, lobbying legislators, working with agencies.
Trying to get incremental change from within the system.
Exactly. But these channels often prioritized what they called resonant frames, language they thought would appeal to policymakers.
Like what?
Things like housing opportunity or choice. These were perceived as more palatable, less confrontational than what were deemed more radical frames like human rights or right to return.
So the human rights language was seen as too challenging.
By some key players, yes. Research suggests that some organizations, like a prominent national affordable housing advocacy group referred to as Housing Org in some analyses, actively marginalize the human rights message,
Why have they done that?
fearing it would damage their legislative agenda in Washington, maybe compromise their relationships with funders, or make it harder to get bipartisan support for policy changes. They saw it as potentially counterproductive to their more mainstream goals.
So it forces this incredibly tough choice for activists, doesn't it?
It's a real bind. Do you stick to your radical principles, speak truth to power using the strongest moral language, and risk being ignored or sidelined?
Or do you soften your message, use the resonant frames to gain a seat at the table, potentially diluting your original transformative impact, but maybe achieving small wins?
It's a constant, difficult negotiation between principle and pragmatism that grassroots groups face all the time.
And it speaks to the ongoing complex struggle for equitable and humane reconstruction in New Orleans and really beyond. The fight for these principles continues.
It does, with some struggles expanding into what's known as the right to the city, a broader concept advocating for all residents, especially the marginalized, to have a say and a stake in how their urban environment is shaped and governed.
And there's also a significant shift, or at least an attempt, towards overhauling federal disaster response legislation, like the Stafford Act.
Right. The Stafford Act typically governs how the government provides disaster relief and dictates federal resources after major emergencies.
And the goal is to incorporate human rights principles directly into those foundational laws.
That's the push. To make equity and human rights central to disaster response from the outset, not an afterthought. It shows that while the battles are hard-fought, often involving difficult compromises, the fundamental questions are still being asked.
Questions about who gets to rebuild, who truly benefits, and who has a right to return and a right to the city, they're still very much alive and evolving.
And this underscores the critical need for deep, rigorous practice and scholarship that actively confronts the persistence of racial and gender inequality in urban contexts, especially now in the wake of increasing climate-related disasters.
Because the New Orleans experience,
Particularly for low-income African-American women and their families, vividly illustrates how natural disasters are not just physical events. They are profound social and economic reconfigurations that expose and exacerbate pre-existing racial and gender inequalities.
it's not an isolated case.
Not at all. It serves as a powerful canary in a coal mine for other communities grappling with the increasing frequency and intensity of climate-related disasters and the complex, urgent issues of achieving truly equitable recovery.
And that wraps up another illuminating exploration here on Meteorology Matters. We hope this look at post-Katrina New Orleans gave you a lot to think about regarding the long-term impacts of hurricanes and these crucial issues of equitable recovery.
It raises fundamental questions.
It really does. When the market's the market, as one official put it, but if that market consistently pushes out the most vulnerable, then what is our collective responsibility? Should housing be treated purely as a commodity or as a fundamental human right for everyone? Something to really ponder.
A crucial question for our times.
You can continue this conversation by hitting that like button, subscribing, and leaving a review for the Meteorology Matters podcast. Your feedback really helps us reach more listeners.
We appreciate the support.
To keep up with all things weather and beyond, you can follow meteorologist Rob Jones on Instagram at meteorologist. That's all one word, meteorologist.
And on TikTok.
On TikTok, he's at TV Meteorologist. And on YouTube, just search for Rob Jones Hurricane. Again, all one word, where you'll also find the Meteorology Matters podcast playlist with all our deep dives.
Great resources there.
We look forward to our next exploration together on Meteorology Matters.